Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're really going to be tackling a period that I think fundamentally reshaped the world as we know it. I think this is going to be especially crucial for anyone studying the political history of international relations.
Absolutely.
Um, and specifically, we're going to be going deep on the transformation of global power dynamics in the post 9/11 world. So think, 2001 to 2008, right? Roughly that period, give or take. And, this isn't just about like a response to a crisis. This was a seismic shift.
It really was. I mean, it was a period that forced, a complete reevaluation of security doctrines, the roles of the international alliances, even the architecture of global power itself. It was huge.
Yeah, like the whole system kind of had to adapt. So our mission, I guess you could say, is to extract some really critical insights from the scholarship, right?
Yeah.
To give our listeners a structured understanding of how these really complex transformations played out, because they're still playing out today, like what were the long-term legacies?
Absolutely. And I think the beauty of this period is that, there's so many different perspectives. We can look at security, of course. How did security get reconfigured? But then we can look at institutions. What happened with the UN? What happened with NATO? And, of course, the rise of new global actors.
Right.
And, really distilling the core shifts in the world order that occurred in response to 9/11 and the immediate aftermath.
Okay, so let's establish the baseline. What did the world even look like before those attacks, before 9/11?
Well, the defining feature of the international system before 9/11 was undoubtedly the post-Cold War, what some call the unipolar moment.
Right.
The U.S. had this unprecedented global power, right? This came after the Soviet Union collapsed, and it felt like liberal democracy had triumphed.
Right. That's like peak Francis Fukuyama, right? The end of history idea.
Exactly. This notion that, well, maybe we're converging towards this global consensus on liberal democratic values. Maybe that's the endpoint of history.
Right, right.
Very optimistic.
Yeah.
But, even amidst this apparent, dominance, you had some more cautious voices
Yeah.
who recognized that, hold on a second, this unipolar moment might not be as stable as it looks.
Yeah.
You had these really brutal ethnic conflicts, like in the Balkans,
Right.
like in Rwanda.
Horrible.
Absolutely tragic. And it revealed, maybe there are limits to this order.
Yeah.
And, can the international community really respond effectively?
Yeah. Yeah. And those were not small conflicts. I mean, the Bosnian War, we're talking like 100,000 deaths estimated. Rwanda, 800,000. That's just
staggering numbers.
Yeah, it's not like the end of history has arrived and everyone's singing Kumbaya. It's like, no, there are still these really intense internal conflicts.
Absolutely.
And they're causing huge problems for international stability.
It really underscores the fact that the post-Cold War order was still, being institutionalized. It wasn't settled. And you also had this growing threat of transnational terrorism. It wasn't just states anymore.
Right. And Al-Qaeda was already active before 9/11, right? We think about the U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 98, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000.
Yes.
And these weren't small attacks. I mean, the embassy bombings alone, over 200 people killed, thousands injured.
It was a clear demonstration of their reach and their intent.
Right.
And I think it's really insightful to understand Al-Qaeda's genesis. It wasn't just, this sudden appearance. Its roots actually lay in the Afghan resistance to the Soviet occupation in the 80s.
Right.
That conflict provided training, networking opportunities.
Yeah, a lot of people forget that. That's where a lot of these folks kind of got their start.
Absolutely. Figures like Osama bin Laden.
Right. And his anti-American ideology. I mean, that became so potent.
It did.
It was fueled by grievances, real or perceived. But like the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War.
Yes.
Support for Israel.
It resonated with a certain segment.
Yeah.
And what Al-Qaeda did really was they fused this decentralized organizational structure with global recruitment. They were very sophisticated in their financing.
Yeah.
And they had this ideology that, was based on a very, very particular and radical interpretation of Islam.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize this was a fringe movement.
Absolutely.
Their interpretation of Islam is rejected by the vast, vast majority of Muslims worldwide.
100%. And, their declarations of war, if you actually go back and look at them, they explicitly cited these grievances. The U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia,
right.
the sanctions against Iraq,
yeah.
U.S. support for Israel. These were the drivers of their of their hostility.
And all of this was happening as the world was becoming increasingly globalized.
Absolutely. I mean, the world was getting more and more interconnected.
Right.
Not just economically, but technologically, culturally.
Yeah.
And this rapid increase in economic interdependence, the spread of technology, it created opportunities, but also vulnerabilities.
Right.
A great example of this is the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98.
Right.
It showed how these economic shocks could just propagate globally.
Yeah, like that domino effect.
Exactly. The world was interconnected, for better or for worse.
So we've got this dominant U.S., but we also have these regional conflicts that just won't go away.
Right.
Transnational terrorism is on the rise. Globalization is accelerating. And, in the midst of all this, you have these international institutions trying to adapt.
Exactly. The UN, NATO, they were trying to figure out, okay, what is our role in this new world? NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 99, without explicit UN Security Council authorization, that was a big deal.
Yeah, that was controversial.
It was a precedent.
Yeah.
Could you intervene outside of traditional UN frameworks?
Yeah.
And then you have the rise of powers like China and India.
Right.
They're not major players yet,
Yeah.
but they're on the horizon. China's economic growth in the 90s, averaging over 9%, that's huge.
Just enormous.
It's a shift in the global balance.
Yeah.
And India, after its liberalization in 91, is also becoming more influential.
Right.
So this was the world before 9/11. Complex, dynamic, a lot of things happening.
And then 9/11 happens and everything changes. I mean, talk about a reconfiguration of security paradigms.
Right. And, the most prominent of these, the phrase everyone knows, the global war on terror.
Yeah.
It was more than just a slogan. It was a whole reconceptualization of U.S. national security. Terrorism, especially the transnational kind, became the organizing principle.
Right. So the whole threat perception changed. It wasn't about rival states anymore.
Exactly.
It was this network.
Yes.
And that had huge implications for how the U.S. allocated resources, how it set its priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. And in 2002, the National Security Strategy really articulated this shift. They introduced this doctrine of preventative action,
Right.
which was a big departure from the traditional understanding of self-defense in international law.
So before, it was like you need an imminent threat.
Right. You can't just attack someone because you think they might attack you later. But this new doctrine said, well, maybe we can. Maybe we need to act preemptively,
Yeah.
even if we don't know exactly when or where an attack might occur.
Which, I mean, you can understand the logic, right? But also, it's super controversial. I mean, internationally, people are like, hold on a second. Does this mean you can just use force whenever you want?
Right. It lowered the threshold.
Yeah.
And the idea of a war against a network rather than a state, I mean, it's unprecedented.
Yeah. How do you even fight a war against a network?
Exactly. Traditional warfare, you have adversaries, objectives, a potential endpoint.
Right.
But the war on terror, it's this diffuse global network. How do you win? How do you even know when it's over?
Right. And I mean, even Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, he was writing memos like, are we creating more terrorists than we're eliminating?
Hey.
It was a fundamental question that they couldn't really answer.
Absolutely. And this new kind of threat also required a whole different approach to intelligence and surveillance.
Yeah. I mean, think about the 9/11 Commission report. They talked about all these missed opportunities because different intelligence agencies weren't sharing information.
Right. There were silos.
Yeah.
And that led to big reforms. The biggest one, probably, was the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Right. To try to coordinate everything.
Exactly. And then you have the technological side. The NSA, with programs like Stellar Wind, they were collecting huge amounts of communications metadata.
Yeah. This is like the beginning of big data in intelligence.
Exactly. And to do this, they needed new legal tools.
Right.
The Patriot Act,
Right.
Sections 2, 15, 702, these expanded the government's surveillance powers.
Yeah. And I mean, you can understand the argument, right? Like, we need these tools to counter this new threat.
Right.
But obviously people were concerned about privacy. It's like, where do you draw the line?
Right. And it wasn't just domestic. International intelligence cooperation also expanded a lot. Existing alliances got stronger, new partnerships emerged.
Right.
But it wasn't always smooth. There were different legal systems, different ethical standards.
Right.
And, some of the things the U.S. did, like extraordinary rendition, sending detainees to third countries.
Right.
Or the CIA's secret detention facilities.
Yeah. That caused a lot of tension with European allies.
It did. when those revelations came out in 2006,
Yeah.
it created a lot of friction.
Right. So the push for more information, more sharing, more collection, it inevitably clashed with privacy and accountability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that tension is still with us today.
Yeah.
Now, the counterterrorism strategies themselves also evolved quite a bit. It wasn't just about military action anymore.
It was much broader.
Yes, it was multidimensional. You had military operations, of course, but also intelligence, finance, border security, even efforts to counter extremist ideologies.
Right. So trying to stop the flow of money,
Yes,
trying to control borders,
Yeah.
and even trying to change hearts and minds.
exactly. And you saw this, for example, with the U.S. Special Operations Forces. Their deployments skyrocketed. By 2006, they were operating in something like 60 countries,
Wow.
compared to around 25 before 9/11.
Huge increase.
Huge. And then on the financial side, you have the Financial Action Task Force, the UN Security Council Resolution 1373, setting new standards,
Yeah.
and then national measures like the U.S. Treasury going after networks like Al-Barakat.
Right. So really trying to cut off the oxygen, so to speak.
Exactly. But even with all these efforts, there were still challenges.
Yeah, because even if you have tactical successes, you disrupt a plot, you kill a leader,
Right.
does that actually solve the problem?
Exactly. What about the strategic impact? What about the unintended consequences?
Yeah, like civilian casualties,
Right.
which can then fuel more resentment, more radicalization.
Absolutely. And the use of drone strikes is a great example of this.
Yeah, it's effective in the short term, but what about the long term?
Exactly. And this brings us back to the tension between security and liberty,
Right.
which played out in a lot of democracies. You saw expanded detention authorities, broader surveillance, stricter immigration controls.
Yeah, and Guantanamo became this symbol of this dilemma.
It did.
People detained without trial, labeled enemy combatants, which is a very controversial legal category.
Very much so.
And then there's the whole issue of enhanced interrogation techniques,
Yeah.
these black sites, waterboarding.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about 100 detainees who went through these secret facilities and something like 39 subjected to these very controversial methods.
And all of this led to legal challenges.
Oh, yeah.
In the U.S., you have cases like Hamdi v. Rumsfeld.
Right, which said even U.S. citizens held as enemy combatants, they have the right to challenge their detention.
Exactly. And Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, which struck down the military commissions that the Bush administration had set up.
Right, so the courts were pushing back, saying, hey, there are limits to what you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had similar things happening in Europe, like the A and Others v. UK case, which dealt with indefinite detention.
Right.
So, even in this time of crisis, democracies were trying to figure out, okay, how do we balance security with the rule of law?
Yeah, because it's not a simple equation. Sometimes restricting rights can actually make you less safe in the long run.
Right.
If you alienate communities, you make it harder to get the cooperation you need for effective counterterrorism.
Absolutely. Think about community policing. That relies on trust.
Right.
If you erode that trust,
Yeah.
it backfires.
So we have this huge shift in security thinking.
Yes.
And of course, it leads to these major military interventions. Afghanistan, Iraq, I mean, these are the defining conflicts of this era.
They really are. Yeah. And let's start with Afghanistan.
Okay.
So in October 2001, the U.S.-led intervention, it achieves rapid initial success. Air power, special forces, supporting the Northern Alliance.
Right.
The Taliban regime is ousted pretty quickly.
Yeah, it seemed like a decisive victory.
It did. And the U.S. ground presence was actually quite small at first. A few hundred CIA operatives, special forces,
Wow.
coordinating with thousands of Afghan fighters, and a lot of air support.
Okay.
So they dismantle Al-Qaeda's base of operations, they remove the Taliban,
Right.
and the Bonn Agreement kind of sets the stage for a new political order.
Okay, so far so good. Right.
Right. But then the challenges start to emerge. Stabilizing the country,
Right.
building an effective government, that's harder than it looks.
Yeah, and the centralized constitution they adopted in 2004.
Right.
I mean, Afghanistan has this long history of decentralized power structures.
Exactly. Different regions, different tribes.
Right.
The centralized system didn't really fit. And a lot of the international attention, the resources,
Yeah.
they focused on Kabul,
Right.
and they neglected the rest of the country. And that's when the Taliban insurgency starts to come back.
Yeah, and there were a lot of reasons for that. I mean, the international security presence outside of the cities, it was thin.
Yes, it was stretched.
And the Afghan government, they weren't really delivering services. They
Right.
weren't establishing the rule of law. You had civilian casualties from military operations.
And of course, the Taliban had safe havens in Pakistan.
Right.
They had support networks.
Yeah. Pakistan was playing a very complex game.
Very complex.
And, the Taliban adapted. They started using IEDs.
Yes, those improvised explosive devices.
And the number of attacks just skyrocketed.
It did. And NATO eventually expanded ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force.
Right.
But by 2008, you have 50,000 troops, and the security situation is still getting worse.
Yeah. And civilian casualties keep rising.
It's a really tragic situation.
It is. And it shows that, winning a war is one thing.
Right.
Building peace is something else entirely.
Absolutely.
And Afghanistan has all these factors, this long history.
Yes.
Social divisions, economic underdevelopment.
The interference from neighbors.
Yeah.
It's incredibly complex.
So let's move on to Iraq. That was controversial from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
The justifications they gave, the WMDs, the links to terrorism, the human rights abuses.
Right.
People are still debating those today.
They are. And you have to remember the context, the 1% doctrine.
Right. That idea that even a tiny chance of a catastrophic event,
You have to act.
you have to act. And Cheney, the vice president, he was very vocal about this, especially regarding Iraq's alleged WMDs.
He was.
But there were dissenting voices, even within the intelligence community itself.
Yes. The 2002 NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq's WMDs, it had these footnotes
Right.
expressing doubts.
Okay, so there was uncertainty, but the decision was made,
Right.
and the invasion happens in March 2003, and militarily, it's a quick victory.
It is. But then, just like in Afghanistan, the real challenges begin.
Yeah, the aftermath.
The aftermath.
Yeah.
And a lot of people point to the decisions made by the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, right after the invasion, disbanding the Iraqi army.
Yes, which put hundreds of thousands of soldiers out of work.
Right.
Trained soldiers.
Debathification, purging people from the government.
Right, removing tens of thousands from their positions.
It's like they dismantled the entire state structure.
And created a lot of resentment in the process.
Yeah, and that fueled the insurgency.
Absolutely. The attacks spiked in the years after the invasion.
And the regional consequences, huge.
Enormous. Saddam, for all his brutality, he was a counterweight to Iran.
Right.
Removing him empowered Iran.
Yeah.
Created a vacuum that all these regional powers tried to fill. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. And then, of course, you have the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Right. AQI.
Which eventually morphs into ISIS.
Brutal sectarian violence.
It's like the whole region became destabilized.
They did.
And the Iraq War raised all these fundamental questions about intervention.
It did. Is it legitimate? Can you impose democracy by force?
Mm-hmm.
What are the unintended consequences?
Yeah. Saddam was a terrible dictator. Halabja, the suppression of the uprisings in 91, horrific.
Absolutely.
But the intervention itself caused so much suffering, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced.
And both interventions had these devastating humanitarian consequences.
Yeah.
In Afghanistan, you have pre-existing problems, but then the conflict exacerbates them.
Right.
Displacement, civilian casualties, like the Uruzgan wedding airstrike in 2002.
Oh, that was awful.
Horrible. 48 civilians killed.
Yeah.
And the economic development was hampered. Aid was corrupted.
Right.
And the counter-narcotics policies, they actually ended up hurting a lot of ordinary Afghans.
Yeah, the unintended consequences.
Exactly.
And in Iraq, you have the collapse of basic services. Like in Baghdad, electricity was down to just a few hours a day at some points.
Right.
Refugee crisis, sectarian violence.
Absolutely. Neighborhoods that used to be mixed were becoming segregated along sectarian lines.
Yeah.
And politically, both countries struggled. They introduced democratic institutions.
Constitutions.
But those institutions became venues for power struggles.
Right.
Sectarian competition.
Yeah.
Like in Afghanistan, the 2004 election, high turnout, but the centralized system couldn't really unify the country.
Right, and people became disillusioned with the government.
Yes.
And in Iraq, the 2005 election, the Muhassa system,
right.
This power-sharing arrangement based on sect.
It didn't really work.
It didn't lead to reconciliation.
No.
So, it shows the limits of trying to engineer institutions.
Absolutely.
In societies that are deeply divided.
And without that underlying consensus,
yeah,
democratic processes can actually make things worse.
Right. It's like they thought, okay, we'll have elections and then everything will be fine. But it's not that simple.
Not at all.
So how do we even evaluate these interventions? Were they legitimate? Were they effective?
Those are the big questions, right?
Yeah.
So on legitimacy, Afghanistan initially had broad international support.
Right, after 9/11.
It was seen as self-defense. You have the UN Security Council Resolution 1368.
Yeah.
NATO invoked Article 5.
Right.
But Iraq, very different. No explicit UN authorization.
Right, they relied on these interpretations of previous resolutions.
Right, 678, 687, 1441.
Which a lot of countries didn't buy.
Right, France, Germany, Russia.
Opposed.
They said, this isn't enough.
Yeah.
And, Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, he called the war illegal.
Right.
So, a lot of questions about the legal basis.
And in terms of effectiveness, I mean, both interventions had initial military success.
Right.
But they really struggled with the long-term stability.
Yes, counterinsurgency is hard.
Yeah.
It's resource intensive.
And the U.S. Army, they even published a new counterinsurgency manual in 2006.
They did.
Acknowledging that you need more than just military force.
You need nation builders.
Yeah.
You need a whole-of-government approach.
And these interventions cost so much.
They did.
Both in terms of money and lives.
Hundreds of billions of dollars.
No.
And it raised the question, could those resources have been used better?
Right, to actually address the root causes of terrorism.
Right, or other global challenges.
And the 9/11 Commission had warned about this, that focusing on state actors might actually distract from the broader fight against transnational terrorism.
Exactly. So were these interventions the right approach?
Yeah, it's a really tough question.
It is. And there's no easy answer.
So these interventions and the whole shift in security thinking, they had a huge impact on international institutions and alliances.
They did. Let's start with NATO. So after 9/11, NATO really transforms itself. It goes from this collective defense organization.
Right, focused on Europe.
Exactly, to this global security provider.
Yeah.
And invoking Article 5 after 9/11.
Right.
That was historic.
Yeah.
It showed that they were willing to act outside their traditional area.
And then they take command of ISAF in Afghanistan.
Yes, ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force.
Right.
A major out-of-area operation.
Yeah, for NATO, that was a big deal.
It was. And they had to adapt. They developed the NATO Response Force,
Right.
new strategic concepts.
Yeah.
But it wasn't easy. There were tensions.
Yeah, burden sharing.
Right. Who's contributing enough?
Strategic priorities.
Yes, especially after the Iraq War.
Yeah, that caused a lot of division within NATO.
It did. France, Germany, they opposed the war.
Right.
And then the defense spending disparities.
Yeah, the U.S. was carrying most of the load.
By 2008, the U.S. was accounting for about 75% of total NATO spending.
So a lot of strain on the alliance.
But they were also resilient. They had the Prague Summit in 2002, focus on capabilities.
Right.
They expanded to include new members from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And in 2010, they came up with a new strategic concept.
Right, incorporating things like counterterrorism, cybersecurity.
Exactly. So NATO was evolving.
Yeah.
But its purpose, its direction, these were open questions.
Right.
And the UN also faced a lot of pressure.
It did.
Initially, there was some unity on counterterrorism. Resolutions 1368, 1373.
Right, expanding the Security Council's authority.
But then Iraq happens.
Yeah.
And the Security Council is completely divided.
U.S., U.K. on one side.
France, Russia, China on the other.
Yeah.
No explicit approval for the war.
And Annan calls it illegal.
Right.
So a major blow to the UN's credibility.
It was. And at the same time, UN peacekeeping is expanding dramatically.
Yeah, from like 13,000 peacekeepers to over 90,000.
Huge increase.
And their mandates are getting more and more complex.
Nation building, civilian protection. It's not just about keeping peace anymore.
Right.
And the Brahimi report in 2000, it said, look, the UN needs to get better at preventing conflict, at deterring aggression.
Yeah.
And there were these debates about UN reform.
Right, especially the Security Council.
Yeah. Should it be expanded? Who gets a seat?
But not much changed.
No. Very little progress.
And this fundamental tension, sovereignty versus human protection, it's still there.
It is. It's at the heart of the UN system.
And regional organizations are becoming more important.
They are.
Like the African Union, it
Yeah.
transitions from the OAU in 2002.
Right. And it has this mandate for more active security engagement.
And Article 4H, which allows for intervention in cases of atrocities.
Exactly. A big change.
But they still face resource constraints.
They do.
And then you have ASEAN.
Yes, they're expanding beyond traditional conflicts.
Right.
To deal with terrorism, maritime security, natural disasters.
Yes.
But they also have limitations.
Right, the Asian way, consensus non-interference.
Exactly.
And the EU is developing its own security capabilities.
Police cooperation, judicial cooperation, counterterrorism measures.
Yeah.
But they have capability gaps, strategic differences.
Right, so it's this multi-level system.
It is. Global, regional, national,
Yeah.
all interacting in complex ways.
And international law is also evolving.
Absolutely.
I mean, transnational terrorism, it challenges the traditional legal distinctions.
It does. Interstate versus non-international conflict, combatants versus civilians, these categories get blurred.
Right.
And the Bush administration, they put forward these very expansive legal theories.
Right, preventive self-defense, unlawful enemy combatants, pushing the boundaries of international law.
And it was very controversial. The non-application of the Geneva Conventions to Al-Qaeda detainees.
Right.
The president claiming broad authority on detention and interrogation.
Yeah, a lot of people said that was going too far.
They did.
And then you have targeted killing, drone strikes.
Right.
Is that legal? What about sovereignty? What about due process?
Huge questions.
And on the other side, you have the responsibility to protect R2P.
Right, which gained momentum after the 2005 World Summit.
Yeah, this idea that states have a responsibility to protect their population.
Yes.
And if they fail, the international community has a responsibility to step in.
But how do you operationalize that?
Right. It's a very difficult concept to put into practice.
It is.
So international law, it's dynamic, it's contested, it's always adapting. But amidst all this change, there's also this reassessment of American power.
Yes.
I mean, the U.S. was still the sole superpower, but its dominance was being challenged.
Right.
And 9/11, in a way, it exposed both the strengths and the weaknesses of American power.
It did. You know, the U.S. could project force globally,
Yeah.
but it also struggled with these asymmetric threats.
Right, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq.
And the focus on the war on terror, the resources poured into these interventions, it created space for other powers to rise.
Right, like China.
Their economic growth was just phenomenal.
And Russia was rebuilding its military.
Yeah.
So unipolarity, it has these inherent limits.
Yeah, it creates incentives for others to balance against you.
Right.
And you can overextend yourself.
Exactly.
So let's talk about Russia.
Okay.
Putin consolidates power.
Yes.
He uses Russia's energy resources very strategically.
Very much so.
And at first, there's some cooperation with the West after 9/11.
Right. Intelligence sharing, even allowing U.S. bases in Central Asia.
But that fades pretty quickly.
It does. NATO expansion, especially the 2004 round.
Right, bringing in more Eastern European countries.
That really alienated Russia.
Western support for democracy promotion in places like Georgia and Ukraine.
Right.
That also created tension.
Yeah.
Yeah, Russia saw that as a threat.
And then disagreements over missile defense.
Yeah.
Russia felt like the U.S. was trying to encircle it.
And they strongly opposed the Iraq War.
They